This is Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederate States of America. The life of Jefferson Phineas Davis is one of sadness and regret. He had not only lost the hope of a new nation, but during his lifetime, he buried 4 of his 6 children. Jeff Davis was born in Kentucky on June 3, 1808. His family moved to Woodville, Mississippi when Jeff was 2. Now this is Rosemont Plantation where Jeff was raised, as the youngest of 10 children born to Samuel and Georgia Davis. When Jeff was 16, Samuel, his dad, died, and Jeff's much older brother Joseph sort of took their dad's place. Joseph had already become quite prominent and owned an 1,800-acre plantation just south of Vicksburg that he called Hurricane. Now Joseph wanted Jeff to have a military career and used his influence to get him appointed to the West Point Military Academy, although Jeff wasn't interested in the military. He could not disappoint his older brother. 4 years later, in 1828, Jefferson Davis graduated from West Point. He was assigned to Fort Crawford, Wisconsin. While he was assigned to Fort Crawford, he met and fell in love with Sarah Knox Taylor. She was the daughter of the fort commander, Colonel Zachary Taylor. Yes, the same Zachary Taylor that years later would become President of the United States. Colonel Taylor did not approve of the romance. He didn't want his daughter to be married to a military man. To try to separate the two, he had Davis transferred. However, Davis refused to leave and resigned his military commission instead. In 1835, Jefferson Davis and Sarah Knox Taylor were married against the wishes of her family. After their marriage, Jeff convinced Sarah that it would be okay for them to travel south, although summertime in the South was the malarial fever season. He was wrong. Shortly after they arrived, they both became deathly ill with the fever. And on September the 15th, 1835, Sarah died. Jeff and Sarah had only been married for 3 months. She was 21 years old. Colonel Taylor blamed Davis for her death. After Sarah's death, Jeff became withdrawn and spent the next 8 years or so clearing land that his brother Joseph had gave him. He called it Briarfield, and it was connected to Joseph's Hurricane Plantation. Now during this time, Davis, with the help of his only slave, Ben Montgomery, built Briarfield into a prosperous plantation. Over the objections of other plantation owners, Joseph and Jeff placed Ben Montgomery overseer over both plantations, Hurricane and Briarfield, a position that was usually held for white men only. After the Civil War, Briarfield was actually sold to Ben Montgomery, the Davis's ex-slave, at which was said to be at a very reasonable price. Now 8 years after Sarah's death, in 1843, Davis ran for a seat in the Mississippi House of Representatives. He lost. This was his first taste of politics. That year at Christmas time, Jeff was visiting his brother Joseph when he met Verena Banks Howell, the daughter of a family friend. Although she was only 17 and he was 35, permission was given by her family to marry. Verena was the granddaughter of New Jersey Governor Richard Howell, but her mother's family were from Mississippi. Jefferson Davis and Verena Howell were married February the 26th, 1845. That same time in 1845, Jefferson Davis's mother, Georgia, passes away. After his mother's death, Jeff run for and was elected to Mississippi Representative at Large to the U.S. Congress. The next year in 1846, Jeff gave up his seat in Congress to enlist in the Mexican War. He was given a command under his former father-in-law, now General Zachary Taylor. During the war, Davis's regiment distinguished itself, making Davis a hero. He was also wounded during a battle, the Battle of Buena Vista. After the battle, General Taylor wrote Davis saying, "My daughter, sir, was a better judge of character than I was." 1 year later, in 1847, after resigning from the military, Davis was appointed to the U.S. Senate by Mississippi Governor Brown. And in 1849, Zachary Taylor was elected President of the United States and remained president until 50 when his death occurred. In 1852, the first of 6 children were born to Jeff and Verena. Samuel Emory Davis was born July the 30th, 1852. That same year, President Pierce appointed Jefferson Davis Secretary of War. He remained Secretary of War until 1856, when President Pierce went out of office. As Secretary of War, Davis built up the military, the same military that he would later fight as President of the Confederacy. He confided in his wife that the South could never win against a much stronger North, but maybe the South could make it so costly for the North that they would eventually let the South secede. While Davis was still Secretary of War in June of 1854, their son Emory, less than 2 years old, died of an undiagnosed disease. The next year, on February the 25th, 1855, their second child, Margaret Howell Davis, was born. She would be the only Davis child to marry and have children. The next year, in 1856, Jeff Davis left Secretary of War and went back to the Senate. In 1857, January the 16th, the Davis's third child was born, Jefferson Davis Jr. In 1858, Davis argued in the Senate against secession. The next year, their fourth child, Joseph Evans, was born on April the 18th, 1859. In January of 1861, Mississippi secedes from the Union. Davis makes a speech at the Senate, stating that it was the saddest day of his life. He had fought secession, but he felt honor-bound to support Mississippi. After resigning from the Senate, the Davis family returned to Briarfield. A month later, in February of 1861, Jefferson Davis was elected temporary president of the Confederacy at the state capitol in Montgomery and elected permanent president of a 6-year term in November of that year. The year 1861 was a busy time for the Davises. Jeff had been elected president, and the Confederate capital in Montgomery was moved from Alabama to Richmond, Virginia. Verena was 35 years old when she became the First Lady of the Confederacy. Jeff Davis was 52. She was also pregnant with her 5th child, William Howell Davis, born 6 December 1861. As President of the Confederacy, Davis's first act sent a peace delegation to Washington, hoping to prevent war. And President Lincoln, trying to hold the Union together, refused to receive the delegation. A few months later, at Fort Sumner, war began. On April the 30th, 1864, tragedy struck the Confederate mansion in Richmond when the Davises' fourth child, 5-year-old Joseph Evans Davis, while climbing over a banister at the Executive Mansion and falling on the brick floor below, and dying in a few minutes later in his mother's arms. 2 months after Joseph's death, the Davises' sixth child, Winnie, was born on June the 27th. During this time, Mrs. Davis had the occasion to witness a young black boy by the name of Jim Limber being beaten up by a grown black man. The Davises took Jim and unofficially adopted him, even giving him their name. Jim was with the Davises when they were captured after the war. Jim was taken from the Davises crying by Union soldiers. They never saw Jim again. In March of 1865, the war was going bad for the South. Jefferson Davis asked Verena to take the children and leave Richmond for their protection. She heads to Charlotte, North Carolina, and rents a house and waits for word from her husband. By April the 10th, Davis learns of Lee's surrender. Davis heads south, leaving Richmond to the advancing Union Army. He was hoping to meet up with General Joseph E. Johnston. When he did, Johnston recommended that Davis give up. Davis keeps heading south, and 2 days later learns that General Johnston had also surrendered. His only hope then was to make it to General Kirby Smith in Texas and continue the struggle from there. On May the 8th, Davis reunited with Verena and the children. And 2 days later, on May the 10th, the Davises' party was captured by Union soldiers. He was quickly charged with treason and taken back to Virginia and imprisoned at Fortress Monroe. For the next 2 years, Verena wrote everyone she could, asking for help for her husband. She was held under guard herself at a Savannah hotel. She sent her children to Canada with their grandmother so that they'd be protected from death threats. Abraham Lincoln had just been assassinated 1 month earlier on the 14th of April, and the Union was calling for the head of Jefferson Davis. Davis spent 2 years in prison, waiting trial. He actually believed that he could show the court that under the Constitution, states had the right to secede. Now this created a dilemma for the government. The government began to look for other charges, such as war crimes, even on one occasion offering Confederate Colonel Wirt life the night before his scheduled hanging if he would state that President Davis ordered mistreatment of prisoners at Andersonville. Wirt refused, stating it would be a lie. He was hanged the next morning. After 2 years in prison in 1867, Jefferson Davis was released under a $100,000 bond that was put up by wealthy friends in the North. Davis was in poor health from his prison stay and virtually broke. For the next few years, he would depend on family and friends for support. After much traveling, visiting ex-Confederates at home and abroad, he eventually settled on a job as president of an insurance company in Memphis, Tennessee. While living on Court Street in Memphis, tragedy struck again. On the 16th of October, 1872, the Davises' fifth child, William Howell Davis, died of diphtheria. He was 10 years old. Sometime around 1875, a very wealthy widow by the name of Sarah Ann Ellis Dorsey learned of Jefferson Davis's plight. She had been the childhood friend of Mrs. Davis, and her late husband were staunch supporters of the Confederacy. She offered Davis the use of a cottage at Bolivar, one of her homes located on the Gulf Coast in Biloxi. You can see that the construction is still going on from the damage here from Hurricane Katrina. Now the peaceful atmosphere and beautiful view of the Gulf the perfect place for Davis to write the rise and fall of the Confederate government. In 1876, daughter Margaret marries Joel Hayes in Memphis. She will raise the only grandchildren the Davises will have. 2 years after Margaret's marriage to Joel Hayes, her brother Jeffrey Davis Jr., the third child of Jeff and Verena, working in a bank for his brother-in-law in Memphis, was suddenly stricken with yellow fever during the Memphis yellow fever epidemic. Jeff Jr. dies October the 16th, 1878. He was 21 years old. After Jefferson Davis Jr.'s death that same year, the widow Sarah Ellis Dorsey dies. In her will, she had bequeathed Bolivar to Davis. By this time, the Davises had only 2 living children, Margaret, who was still living in Memphis and would bring the grandchildren to Biloxi to visit their grandparents, and Winnie, who lived with her parents at Bolivar. It is said that Jefferson Davis never turned away a Confederate veteran. He felt that their sacrifice was more for him than it was for the Confederacy. During these years, Davis and his daughter Winnie would attend Confederate reunions across the country, and Winnie was considered a daughter of the Confederacy and much beloved in the South. And in 1887, while staying with a family friend up north, she formed a relationship with a New York attorney by the name of Fred Wilkinson. In 1889, she announced their engagement. No one expected such an outcry from ex-Confederates and Southerners over Winnie wanting to marry a Yankee. It was decided that Jeff Davis himself was the only one that could calm the outcry. Davis supported the marriage, but before he could speak to the public, he became very sick while visiting friends in New Orleans with acute bronchitis. Jefferson Davis died around 1 a.m. on the 6th December 1889. His funeral was one of the largest ever held in New Orleans. His final resting place is the Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. Jefferson Davis, Confederate president, was 81 years old. The next year in 1890, Winnie's engagement to Fred Wilkinson ended under much public pressure. She never married, and neither did he. In 1891, Winnie and Verena moved to New York City in order to make money to live on. Verena wrote newspaper articles for a New York newspaper, and Winnie wrote magazines and books and continued her close relationship with Confederate organizations. In 1898, Winnie was attending a Confederate reunion in Atlanta, Georgia, when she was drenched in a sudden rainstorm. Unable to change her wet clothes for several hours on a long train trip to meet her mother back in Rhode Island, by the time she arrived at the Rockingham Hotel, she was running a severe fever. Although the hotel was closing for the season, they allowed Winnie and her mother to stay. She was too sick to be moved. On September the 18th, 1898, Winnie Davis, daughter of the Confederacy, died from malarial gastritis. Thousands attended her funeral, and she was buried in the family plot at the Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond. Winnie Davis was 34 years old. 4 years after Winnie's death, her mother sold Bolivar to a Mississippi Confederate organization with the stipulation that it would be used as a Confederate veterans home for ex-Confederates. Also, after the last Confederate died, it was to be turned into a monument for the Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Now this is the back side of the Davis home, and not far from the back is the Confederate Cemetery, and in the Confederate Cemetery is also the tomb of the unknown Confederate soldier. In the 1940s, Jefferson Davis's dad, Samuel Davis, was moved from the Hurricane Plantation where he was buried to the Confederate Cemetery at Bolivar. 4 years later, on the 16th of October 1906, Verena, First Lady of the Confederacy, passed away from pneumonia. Her only living child, Margaret, was by her side. Verena was honored with a military escort, and she's buried next to her husband and family at Richmond. Verena was 80 years old. 3 years later, after her mother's death, Margaret passed away, 18 July 1909. A few years earlier, Margaret and her family had moved from Memphis to Colorado Springs, Colorado. But Margaret was also buried in the Davis plot in Richmond. Margaret Davis was 54 years old. Her descendants are still living in Colorado Springs. In 1978, on the 17th of October, President Jimmy Carter, a Southern president from Georgia, posthumously restored U.S. citizenship to Jefferson Davis.